She had exactly $10 left in her account, and she gave all of it to a stranger sitting on the cold sidewalk outside the hospital. A man with a torn jacket and tired eyes who hadn't asked her for a thing. She had no idea who he was. She had no idea that the unshaven man she'd just handed her last $10 to was one of the most recognizable faces in the world. And she certainly had no idea that the small thing she did at 4 in the morning, running on no sleep and no money, was about to come back to her in a way she could never have imagined. Stay with me to the end of this one, because the part that stopped me cold wasn't what he gave her back. It was what he said to her 3 weeks later, in front of a room full of people, when he finally explained why he'd been sitting on that sidewalk in the first place. Elena Reyes was a night shift nurse, and she'd been one for 9 years. If you've never worked nights in an emergency room, it's hard to explain what it does to a person. The world flips upside down. You sleep when everyone else is awake. You eat dinner at sunrise. You hold the hands of people on the worst night of their lives. You clean up things most people will never have to see. And then you drive home in the gray, early light with your hands still shaking. And you do it again the next night, and the next. Elena was good at it. The other nurses said she had the kind of calm that spread to everyone around her. When a patient was scared, she got quieter and steadier, not louder. When a family was falling apart in the waiting room, she was the one who knelt down to their level and told them the truth gently. She'd been doing it so long that she'd half forgotten she was a person who also had needs, who also got tired, who also sometimes sat in her car after a shift and just cried for a few minutes before turning the key. That winter had been a hard one for her. Her hours had been cut after the hospital restructured. Her rent had gone up. Her car had needed a repair she couldn't really afford but couldn't really go without, since the car was the only way she got to work. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, she'd quietly slipped into that place a lot of good, hard-working people end up. The place where you're doing everything right and the math still doesn't work. On the night this story happened, Elena had finished a brutal 12-hour shift. 2 codes. A child with a broken arm who wouldn't stop crying until she sat with him. An elderly man who came in alone and left this world the same way, holding her hand because there was no one else. By the time she clocked out at a little before 4 in the morning, she was running on fumes, physically, emotionally, financially. She had checked her bank account in the break room that night. $10. That was it, until payday, which was still 4 days away. She stepped out into the cold. The street outside the hospital was empty and quiet, the way only a city can be at 4 in the morning. And that's when she saw him. He was sitting on the sidewalk with his back against the brick wall of the building across the street, knees pulled up, an old torn jacket wrapped around him against the cold. He had a few days of gray stubble. His eyes were open, looking at nothing. He wasn't holding a cup. He wasn't holding a sign. He wasn't asking anyone for anything. He was just there, the way the invisible people of every city are just there, the ones the rest of the world has trained itself to walk past. And Eleni, who walked past 100 hard things every single night because she had to, who had nothing left in her tank and $10 left in the world, Elena stopped. She didn't know why. She'd tell people later that she couldn't fully explain it. Maybe it was the elderly man who died holding her hand a few hours earlier. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was just that something in his face reminded her that everyone sitting on a sidewalk at 4 in the morning is somebody's son. She walked over. "Hey," she said softly. "It's freezing out here. Have you eaten anything?" The man looked up at her, surprised. People didn't usually talk to him. "I'm all right," he said. His voice was rough and quiet. "There's an all-night place 2 blocks down," she said. "It's not much, but it's warm and the coffee's hot." And then, before she could let herself think about it, before the practical part of her brain could remind her about the $10 and the 4 days and the rent, she reached into her bag, pulled out the bill, and held it out to him. "Here, get yourself something warm, please." The man stared at the money. Then he stared at her. "I can't take that," he said. "You can," she said. "You're going to. It's cold and you need it more than I do tonight." Which wasn't even true. She needed it just as much. But it was the kind of lie she told all the time to make people accept help. He took it slowly, like it weighed more than $10. And for just a second, something moved across his face, something she couldn't read. He looked at her name badge, still clipped to her scrubs. "Elena R., RN." "Elena," he said. "Thank you. You have no idea, thank you." "Stay warm," she said. And she gave him a tired smile, and she walked to her car. And she drove home in the gray morning light with nothing in her account and a strange, quiet warmth in her chest that she couldn't quite explain. She had no idea what she'd just done, because the man on the sidewalk was not who he appeared to be. His name was Marcus Hale. And if you'd shown his face to almost anyone in the world, cleaned up on a screen, the way they were used to seeing him, they'd have known him instantly. 3 decades of films. The kind of actor whose movies your parents loved and you loved, and your kids would probably love too. The kind of face that had looked out from movie posters in every city on Earth, including this one. So what was he doing on a sidewalk at 4 in the morning, unshaven, in a torn jacket, with no one recognizing him? The simple answer is the one almost nobody guessed. Marcus Hale had spent his whole career being looked at. Cameras, crowds, fans, photographers. And somewhere along the way, he'd developed a private practice that he'd never told a single reporter about. Every so often, when a role required it, and his next role was the hardest of his life, a man who'd lost everything and ended up on the street, he would actually go and live a piece of it. Not for a photo op, not to be seen. He'd put on old clothes, stop shaving, and quietly go spend time in the parts of the city that the cameras never pointed at. He'd sit, he'd watch, he'd listen. He wanted to understand, really understand, what it felt like to be invisible. That night, he'd been sitting outside the hospital for almost 3 hours. And in 3 hours, hundreds of people had walked past him. Doctors, nurses, visitors, security guards. Not one of them had looked at him. Not one had said a word. He'd started to feel something he hadn't expected to feel. A kind of slow, cold loneliness. The specific loneliness of being a body that the world has decided not to see. He understood, sitting there, that this was the thing his character lived with every single day. And it had shaken him more than he'd thought it would. And then, at 4 in the morning, when he was about ready to get up and go home to his warm house and his easy life, a nurse with exhausted eyes and $10 to her name had stopped, knelt down, called him warm, and given him everything she had. She hadn't recognized him. That was the whole point. She had no reason in the world to be kind to him. He couldn't do anything for her. He couldn't get her a role or get her noticed or pay her back. She didn't know he could do any of those things. She'd helped him for the only reason that actually counts. Because he was a cold human being and she was a warm one. And she had something and he looked like he had nothing. Marcus Hale sat on that sidewalk and looked down at a crumpled $10 bill. And for the first time in a very long time, a man who had everything started to cry. He could have let it end there. A nice story he'd tell at dinner parties. The night a stranger restored his faith in people. But Marcus Hale was not the kind of man who let it end there. He still had her name, Elena R. RN. He knew the hospital, and he had resources most people only dream about. It took his team about a day to quietly find out who she was, and what they found only made it worse or better, depending on how you look at it. They learned about the cut hours. They learned she'd given away her last $10 4 days before payday. They learned that this nurse, who'd spent 9 years catching other people when they fell, had been quietly falling herself and telling absolutely no one. Now, here's where a lesser man would have just sent money. Written a check, had it delivered, felt good about himself. And Marcus did want to help her badly. But he kept thinking about the way she'd lied to make him take the money. You need it more than I do. And he understood something about her. Elena was a person who gave. Asking her to simply receive with nothing in return might not land the way he wanted it to. He wanted to give her something she couldn't refuse and couldn't explain away. He wanted to give it to her in a way that told her the truth, that what she'd done mattered, that she'd been seen, that the universe was not, in fact, indifferent. So he made some calls. 3 weeks later, the hospital held what the staff were told was a small appreciation event, a thank you for the night shift teams, organized in partnership with a charitable foundation. Elena almost didn't go. She was tired. She was still broke. The last thing she wanted was a room full of polite speeches. But her supervisor practically pushed her out the door. And so she went, in her good cardigan, expecting nothing. The room was full of nurses and doctors, and a few people she didn't recognize in nicer clothes. There was coffee, and there were little sandwiches, and there was a small stage at the front. And after a few short speeches about the foundation and the hard work of the night teams, the person at the microphone said there was a special guest who'd asked to say a few words. And Marcus Hale walked out onto the stage. The room made a sound, that collective intake of breath that happens when a face you've only ever seen on a screen turns out to be a real person standing 20 feet away. People started whispering. Phones came out. Elena, near the back, felt her stomach do something strange, though she couldn't have said why. She didn't recognize him as the man from the sidewalk. Clean-shaven, in a simple dark sweater, he looked exactly like Marcus Hale and nothing like a man in a torn jacket at 4 a.m. He thanked everyone for having him. He talked briefly about a role he was preparing for and about how the preparation had taken him somewhere he hadn't expected to go. And then he said this. A few weeks ago, I spent a night out on the street near here. On purpose, for the work. I won't pretend I understood even a fraction of what people who live that way actually carry. But I learned one thing very fast. He paused. I learned what it feels like to be invisible. I sat on a sidewalk for 3 hours, and hundreds of good people walked past me, and not one of them saw me. I don't blame them. The world teaches us to look away. I've looked away 1,000 times myself. The room had gone completely silent. And then, Marcus said, at 4 o'clock in the morning, one person stopped. His eyes moved across the room, slowly, searching. She knelt down. She asked me if I'd eaten. She told me it was cold. And then she gave me $10 and told me I needed it more than she did. His voice caught, just slightly. I found out later that it was the last $10 she had. 4 days before payday. She'd just finished a 12-hour shift. She had nothing left to give, and she gave it anyway. To a stranger who could do nothing for her because she didn't know who I was, and because to her it didn't matter who I was. I was just cold, and she was just kind. And then he found her, near the back, in her good cardigan, already starting to shake. Elena, he said, into the microphone, in front of the whole room. "I've been waiting 3 weeks to say thank you." She put her hand over her mouth. The nurses around her turned to look at her, and the room broke into a kind of stunned, rising applause. And Elena Reyes stood there, exhausted and broke and seen, and could not say a single word. Marcus came down off the stage and crossed the room to her, and he took both her hands in his. And he said the thing I told you about at the very beginning, the thing that stopped me cold. He said quietly, just for her, though everyone heard it. "You stopped for a man who had nothing. So I want you to understand something. You are not invisible. You have never been invisible. The whole time you've been catching everyone else, somebody was going to come along and catch you. It just took a while. I'm sorry it took so long." What he gave her, he gave quietly after that, the way the best gifts are given. The foundation he'd partnered with covered her back rent and her car repair, and then set up something larger, a fund in her name, to quietly help hospital staff who were drowning silently the way she had been, so that the next nurse running on $10 and no sleep would have somewhere to turn. He made sure her name was on it. He said she'd earned the right to have her kindness outlive the moment. But Elena will tell you, to this day, that none of that was the part that changed her. The money fixed the math. The thing that healed her was different. It was being seen. It was learning that on the loneliest, hardest, most invisible night of a long, invisible year, the small good things she did in the dark, when she thought no one was watching and no one would ever know, somebody saw it. And it came back. I think about this story more than I expected to. And not because a movie star was generous, though he was. The part that stays with me is what he said about being invisible. Because the truth is, most of us walk past the person on the sidewalk. Most of us are tired and broken our own way and trained to look away. There is no shame in it. It's just what the world teaches us. But every now and then, there's an Elena. Someone with nothing left who stops anyway. Someone who looks at the invisible person and decides to see them. And here's the thing I can't get out of my head. She had no idea who he was. She got nothing out of it. She thought it would cost her and disappear into the dark forever. That's what makes it real. Real kindness is the kind you do when there's no camera, no reward, no chance of payback. When it's just you and a cold stranger at 4 a.m. and $10 you can't afford to give. That's the kind that comes back. Maybe not in 3 weeks, maybe not from a movie star, but it comes back. So here's what I'll ask you. Sometime this week, you're going to walk past someone the world has decided not to see. You'll feel it, that little pull, that small voice that says stop. Most of the time, we talk ourselves out of it. This week, just once, don't. Stop. See them. You have no idea what it might come back as. And if this story moved you, leave a comment with one word, seen, just so I know you made it all the way to the end. And so I know there are still people out there willing to stop. If you believe the world needs more Elenas in it, the quiet ones who give when no one's watching, then subscribe. Because those are the only people we make stories about on this channel. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.